In the midst of a storm, a 17-year-old girl awoke to screams that ripped through the hallway of the city's most notorious mafia boss's mansion. Guards burst in, finding her huddled under a table, trembling and unable to breathe. As the boss knelt beside her, she clutched his sleeve and whispered through her tears, "Please, don't let them take me home." This story will keep you glued to the screen. Watch until the end, like, and comment with the name of the city you're currently watching to let me know how far the story has progressed. The scream cut through Blackthorn Manor at 2:47 in the morning like a blade dragged across glass. It came from the second floor, East Wing, the room at the end of the corridor where the girl slept, or tried to sleep. Most nights she lasted until 3, sometimes 4, before the sound started. Tonight was worse. Tonight sounded like something inside her had finally cracked open. 2 armed guards hit the hallway within seconds, boots heavy on the hardwood, rifles up. The taller one, a man named Kessler, who had served 3 combat tours before joining Dorian Voss's security detail, reached the door first. He'd heard men scream in firefights, in interrogation rooms, in the back seats of cars speeding away from jobs gone sideways. None of it sounded like this. This was a teenage girl tearing herself apart from the inside. He pushed the door open. The bed was empty, sheets twisted and thrown to the floor. The lamp knocked sideways, casting a slanted blade of light across the carpet. And there, wedged between the desk and the wall, knees drawn to her chest, fingers clawing at her own arms, hard enough to leave marks. Rowan Vale, 17 years old, 93 pounds the last time anyone managed to get her on a scale. Dark circles carved so deep under her eyes they looked permanent, hair tangled and damp with sweat. She was shaking so hard the desk rattled against the wall behind her. Kessler lowered his weapon. He didn't move closer. He'd learned that the hard way 2 months ago when he'd tried to help her up during a panic attack and she'd bitten through the skin of his forearm. Not out of violence, out of pure animal terror. "Get Voss," he said to the guard behind him. The second guard hesitated. "It's almost 3 in the—" "I said get him." Dorian Voss was not asleep. He hadn't slept through a full night in over a decade, a consequence of the life he'd built and the enemies that came with it. He was in his study on the ground floor, jacket off, sleeves rolled to his elbows, reviewing financial documents spread across a desk that had once belonged to a federal judge, purchased at auction after that judge had been convicted of taking bribes from one of Dorian's competitors. The irony had pleased him at the time. Now it was just a desk. He was 44 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a face that looked like it had been assembled from hard decisions and bad weather. His hair was dark, threaded with gray at the temples, and his hands were the hands of a man who had done ugly things with precision. He ran a criminal empire that stretched across 6 states, controlled dockyards, construction unions, and private security contracts worth hundreds of millions. He had buried friends, destroyed enemies, and sat across from men who wanted him dead without blinking. When the guard appeared in the doorway and said the girl was screaming again, Dorian set his pen down slowly. He didn't rush. He never rushed. Rushing was what weak men did when they didn't know what was coming. Dorian always knew what was coming, except with her. He climbed the stairs in silence. The hallway was lit by wall sconces that threw warm light across oil paintings and mahogany panels, all of it expensive, all of it tasteful, all of it designed to make visitors forget they were inside a fortress. The carpet was thick enough to swallow footsteps. The walls were reinforced with steel plating behind the plaster. Every window was bulletproof. The estate sat on 12 acres of private land surrounded by walls, cameras, and men who were paid very well to ensure no one got in or out without authorization. And yet the most dangerous thing inside this building was the sound of a girl crying. Dorian stopped at the doorway. Kessler stepped aside without a word. Rowan was still wedged behind the desk, her breathing ragged and shallow, her eyes open but unfocused, locked on something no one else could see. She was whispering to herself, the same words, over and over. "Don't let them. Don't let them. Don't let them." Dorian crossed the room slowly. He pulled the desk chair aside, lowered himself to one knee, and waited. He didn't touch her. He didn't speak. He just positioned himself where she could see him if she chose to look. It took 4 minutes. Her eyes found his. The terror didn't leave, but something else flickered behind it. Recognition. The thin, desperate thread of a person who knows they are drowning and has spotted the only solid thing in the water. Rowan. His voice was low, not soft. Dorian Voss didn't do soft, but controlled, measured. The voice of a man who had learned that volume was a weapon best used sparingly. You're in the manor. You're safe. Her fingers released the skin of her arms, red crescents where her nails had dug in. She reached out and grabbed the sleeve of his shirt, twisting the fabric in her fist like a child gripping a lifeline. Please, she whispered, don't let them take me back. Dorian studied her face. The fear there was absolute, not the fear of a girl having a bad dream, the fear of someone who had been hunted. No one is taking you anywhere, he said. She held his sleeve until her breathing slowed, until her grip loosened, until the shaking reduced to a tremor and then to stillness. And even then, even after Kessler brought water and a blanket, even after the guards returned to their posts and the hallway fell quiet again, she didn't let go completely. Dorian sat on the floor beside the desk for another hour. He didn't ask questions. He'd stopped asking questions about Rowan's past 3 weeks after she arrived. Not because he didn't want to know, because every time he asked, she shut down so completely it took days to get her to eat again. He'd found her 4 months ago during what was supposed to be a routine operation. His people had been tracking a rival network running money through a string of shell companies tied to a real estate development group on the eastern seaboard. The trail led to a property outside a town called Grayfield, a private estate, gated, well-secured, owned by a family named Vale. Dorian hadn't gone there for the girl. He'd gone there for the money. What his team found was something else. The house was enormous. 6 bedrooms, a pool, a 3-car garage, a manicured lawn that stretched down to a private lake. From the outside, it looked like the cover of a magazine. Inside was a different story. Most of the rooms were locked. The kitchen was stocked with food, but the portions stored separately in a locked pantry suggested someone was being rationed. There were cameras in every hallway, not security cameras, but interior surveillance pointed at specific doors. And in the basement, behind a reinforced door with a deadbolt that locked from the outside, they found a room. Small. No windows. A mattress on the floor. A bucket in the corner. A stack of textbooks, most of them outdated. A single overhead light controlled by a switch outside the door. The girl sitting on the mattress looked up when they broke the lock. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She just stared at them with the emptiest eyes Dorian had ever seen and said, "Are you here to take me somewhere else?" That question had lived inside Dorian's chest like a splinter ever since. He hadn't planned to bring her to Blackthorn. He'd planned to call the authorities, drop the girl somewhere safe, and move on. But the moment his team started pulling at the thread pulled back. The Vale family had connections. Lawyers, judges, local law enforcement, all on the payroll or compromised. Rowan had been reported as a runaway. There was an active missing persons case built on fabricated evidence. Her medical records had been altered to include diagnoses of severe psychological instability, diagnoses made by a psychiatrist who was on retainer for the Vale family's legal team. If Dorian had handed her over to the system would have handed her right back. So he didn't. He brought her to the manor, gave her the room in the East Wing, assigned Kessler to her floor, told his household staff to feed her, clothe her, and leave her alone unless she asked for something. For the first 2 weeks, she didn't ask for anything. She barely spoke. She ate only when food was left outside her door, and even then she took it into the room and ate on the floor, her back to the wall, facing the entrance. She flinched at voices. She startled at doors closing. She never turned her back on anyone. Slowly, over weeks, she began to emerge. A few words at a time, a tentative step into the hallway, a question about whether she was allowed to use the library. The question broke something in Dorian's chest, not because it was unusual, but because of the word she used, allowed, as if permission to read a book was something that could be revoked. By the 3rd month, she moved through parts of the manor with something approaching normalcy. She read constantly. She ate at the kitchen table, sometimes with staff, sometimes alone. She spoke to Kessler about small things, the weather, the dogs that patrolled the grounds, a bird she'd seen from her window. She avoided Dorian. Not out of fear exactly, but out of the careful caution of someone who understood that kindness from powerful men usually came with conditions. Dorian let her keep her distance. He had his own reasons for not getting attached, but she had nightmares every night, and every night, without fail, she screamed. The morning after the latest episode, Dorian sat in his study across from a woman named Marin Cross. Marin was 52, silver-haired, razor-sharp, and one of the few people alive who could tell Dorian Voss he was wrong without consequence. She ran his legitimate operations, the legal side of his empire, the corporate holdings, the charitable foundations that laundered his reputation while he laundered everything else. She was also the closest thing he had to a conscience. "You can't keep her here forever," Marin said. She sat in the leather chair across from his desk, legs crossed, a folder open on her lap. "This is a criminal compound, Dorian, not a foster home. She's safe here. She's hiding here. There's a difference." Dorian leaned back. "What are you suggesting?" Marin slid a brochure across the desk. It was glossy, expensive, printed on heavy stock. The cover showed a stone building surrounded by green hills and a lake. Aldworth Academy, a private boarding school in Switzerland. Full security detail, discreet enrollment, a program designed for students with, as the brochure delicately phrased it, complex personal circumstances. "It's the best in the world," Marin said. "Private rooms, around-the-clock security, no digital footprint. She could study, build a life, be around people her own age. I've already spoken with the headmaster." Dorian picked up the brochure. He turned it over in his hands like a man examining a weapon. "She's 17, Marin continued. "In a year she'll be 18. And then what? She stays here, lives in a fortress surrounded by armed men and criminal infrastructure? You know that's not a life." He did know. That was the problem. He thought about the girl wedged behind the desk at 3 in the morning, the red marks on her arms, the words she kept repeating. He thought about the way she flinched when someone raised their voice, the way she counted exits in every room, the way she slept with a knife under her pillow. A kitchen knife she'd taken on her second night, thinking no one had noticed. Everyone had noticed. No one had taken it away. "I'll bring it up with her," Dorian said. Marin studied him for a long moment. "Be careful how you do it. She trusts you." The word landed heavier than she intended. Trust. From a girl who had been locked in a basement by her own family. Dorian wasn't sure he deserved that word, and he was certain he didn't know what to do with it. He found Rowan in the library that afternoon. She was sitting cross-legged on the floor between two shelves, a book open on her lap, her back against the wall. Always the wall. She looked up when he entered, and the slight tension in her shoulders, the automatic assessment, the split-second calculation of threat, told him everything about what her life had been before. "Can I sit?" he asked. She nodded. He lowered himself to the floor across from her. It was an absurd image. The most feared crime lord in the region sitting on a library floor like a man waiting for a bus. But he'd learned that height mattered with Rowan. Standing over her triggered something. Eye level was safer. "I want to talk to you about something," he said. Her body went still. Not relaxed stillness. The stillness of an animal that has just heard a sound in the brush. "I've been looking into options," he said carefully, "for your future. Something beyond this place." The color drained from her face so fast it was visible. "There's a school," he continued. "Overseas, private, secure. They have—" "No!" The word came out flat and immediate. No hesitation. No consideration. "Rowan, listen. No." She closed the book. Her hands were shaking. "You're sending me away." "I'm not sending you away. I'm trying to give you—" "You're sending me away." Her voice cracked. The trembling moved from her hands to her shoulders, her jaw, her whole frame. "You said no one would take me anywhere. You said that. You said it last night. This is different. It's not different." She was on her feet now, the book fallen to the floor, her eyes bright with the kind of fear that doesn't argue. It begs. Please don't do this. I'll do anything. I'll be quiet. I won't bother anyone. I won't take up space. Just please don't send me away." The words hit Dorian like a fist to the sternum. Not because of what she said, because of how she said it. Like she'd rehearsed it, like she'd begged before, in another place, in another room, and it hadn't worked. "Rowan." She was already backing toward the wall, her arms wrapped around herself, her breathing accelerating into the shallow, rapid pattern he recognized from the panic attacks. "I'll be good," she whispered. "I promise I'll be good. Dorian stood. He didn't move toward her. He kept his hands visible, his voice level. No one is sending you away today. Do you hear me? Not today. It took 20 minutes to bring her down from the edge. 20 minutes of standing in a library while a 17-year-old girl bargained for her own existence with the desperation of someone who believed, truly believed, that her worth was conditional, that staying required earning, that safety was a privilege that could be revoked. After she finally retreated to her room, Dorian stood in the library alone. He looked at the book she'd dropped. Then he looked at the shelf behind where she'd been sitting. Something was wrong. The books on the bottom shelf were pushed forward, not flush with the back of the case. He crouched and slid several aside. Behind them, wedged against the wall, was a manila envelope. He opened it. Inside were newspaper clippings, photographs, printed pages from court records, a custody petition, a guardianship filing, medical reports with Rowan's name on them, evaluations he'd never seen, written by doctors he'd never heard of, all concluding the same thing. The subject is a danger to herself and others and requires involuntary commitment. The dates on the document span 3 years. At the bottom of the envelope, folded into a small square, was a single photograph. It showed a family gathered around a dining table. Expensive clothes, expensive wine, expensive smiles. At the edge of the frame, barely visible, a girl sat in a chair slightly separated from the group. Her head was down. Her plate was empty. Dorian turned the photograph over. On the back, in Rowan's handwriting, 2 words. They're coming. He sat on the library floor for a long time, holding that photograph, and felt something shift inside him that he hadn't felt in years. Not anger, something colder, something that made plans. He pulled out his phone and dialed a number he used only for matters that couldn't be discussed on any other line. "It's Voss," he said. "I need everything you can find on the Vale family. Every asset, every account, every legal filing, every dirty secret, and I need it yesterday." He hung up without waiting for a response. Then he looked at the photograph one more time. The girl at the edge of the frame, head down, plate empty, and made a decision that would drag him into a war he hadn't started, against enemies he hadn't chosen, for a girl who wasn't his blood, but was, somehow, already his responsibility. Outside the library windows, the rain had stopped, but the storm was just beginning. The call went to a man named Aldrich Thorne. Thorne ran a private intelligence firm out of a nondescript office building in the financial district, 7 floors up, no signage on the door, no listing in any directory. His clients were the kind of people who couldn't use official channels, not because they were necessarily criminals, though many were, but because official channels left paper trails and paper trails left bodies. Thorne's firm left nothing. He'd worked for hedge fund managers who needed to know if their partners were lying, for politicians who needed to know what their opponents knew, and for men like Dorian Voss who needed to know everything about everyone before anyone knew they were looking. He called back at 6 in the morning. Dorian was already at his desk. "The Vale family," Thorne said without preamble. "Casimir Vale is the patriarch. 71 years old, 2 strokes, mostly ceremonial at this point. His son, Elliot Vale, runs the day-to-day. 46, Harvard Law, 3 terms on the Grayfield City Council before he pivoted to private equity. His wife is Sylvia Vale, Sylvia Holt before the marriage, sits on 4 nonprofit boards, very visible in the right circles. They have 2 adult children of their own. The girl, Rowan, is the daughter of Elliot's younger brother, Nathaniel. Nathaniel died 6 years ago, ruled an accident. Car went into a lake outside of Millhaven." Dorian was quiet. "The girl's mother?" he said. "Unclear. There's a birth certificate with a mother listed, Cara Vane, but the address on file is a vacant lot in a town that doesn't have a lot registry. No tax records, no social security activity after the year Rowan was born. She either walked away or she was helped out of the picture." Dorian pressed his thumb against the edge of his desk, hard enough to feel the wood grain. "The trust fund," he said. Paper shuffled on the other end of the line. "Rowan's grandfather, the original patriarch, Harlan Vale, set it up before he died. Harlan apparently didn't trust Elliot. Smart man. The trust was designed to pass to Nathaniel's children directly upon Harlan's death, bypassing Elliot's branch entirely. We're talking about $38 million in assets. Real estate, stocks, a private holdings company." And Nathaniel's dead. Nathaniel's dead, which means the trust passes to Rowan, which means Elliot's family has been sitting on $38 million that was never legally theirs. Dorian let that land. How much is left? He asked. Silence for a beat. Our preliminary estimate puts the current accessible balance somewhere around $9 million. They've been moving money out for years, shell companies, overseas accounts, domestic transfers disguised as legal fees and management costs. Who signed off on the management? That's the elegant part, Thorne said, and there was something like professional admiration in his voice that Dorian found nauseating. Rowan was declared a minor ward under Elliot's guardianship 18 months after Nathaniel died. The guardianship gives Elliot signatory control over all her assets until she turns 21, or until she's declared permanently incompetent. Dorian went still. The psychiatric evaluations, he said. 3 of them, all conducted by a Dr. Merritt Gale, who is also the personal physician for Elliot Vale's holding company. All 3 evaluations conclude that Rowan Vale is a danger to herself, severely paranoid, delusional, and in need of long-term institutional care. The last evaluation was filed 8 months ago. 8 months ago. 2 months before Dorian's people found her in that basement. She's not paranoid, Dorian said. His voice came out flatter than he intended. No, Thorne agreed. She's correct about everything that's happening to her, which is significantly worse. Dorian sat with that for a moment. Outside his window, dawn was doing something half-hearted across the rooftops. Gray light. The city waking up badly, the way it always did. There's one more thing, Thorne said, and I want to be direct with you about this. When aren't you? The Vale family retained a firm called Norcroft Group 3 weeks ago. Norcroft does asset recovery, and in certain discrete contexts, what they call relocation assistance. They're not lawyers, Dorian. They're extraction specialists, the kind you hire when a legal route isn't moving fast enough. The library. The photograph. The 2 words on the back. They're coming. She'd known. Somehow, she'd already known. How long before they move? Dorian said. That depends on how much they know about where she is. If they've tracked her to Blackthorn, you're already on a clock. If they haven't, find out. He paused. And Thorne, do it fast. He hung up and sat in silence for 60 seconds. Then he called Kessler. Full perimeter sweep, now. I want eyes on every vehicle within a quarter mile of the gate, and I want the camera archives from the last 72 hours reviewed before noon. We expecting company? We're preparing for it. There's a difference. Kessler didn't waste time asking more questions. That was why Dorian paid him what he paid him. Marin arrived at 8. She didn't knock. She walked into the study, took one look at Dorian's face, and closed the door behind her. You found something, she said. Sit down. She sat. He told her everything, the trust, Elliot, the psychiatric evaluations, the Norcroft group. He laid it out the way he always laid things out, clean, sequential, without drama, and watched Marin's expression move from sharp attention to something colder and more specific. When he finished, she didn't speak for a long moment. You understand what this means, she said finally. If the Norcroft group is already in play, the Vales have made a decision. They're not trying to negotiate. They're not trying to reach you through channels. They want the girl back in their possession before any of this gets to a courtroom. I know. And if they get her back, I know, Marin. She leaned forward. The school idea is dead. Yes. So what's the plan? Dorian looked at the file on his desk. 30 pages of Thorne's preliminary notes, printed and organized because Dorian was the last person in his organization who still preferred paper to screens. He could see it all there, the fraud, the forgeries, the methodical dismantling of a dead man's daughter. 3 years of someone else's theft wearing the clothes of legal process. We fight it, he said. Legally, first. I want our attorneys on the guardianship filing by end of day. I want a forensic accountant into the trust documents by tonight. And I want to know everything about Dr. Merritt Gale. That'll take weeks, months. Then we start now. Marin absorbed this. She's going to need to know, she said carefully. Rowan. She needs to understand what's happening. I know that too. He stood. I'll talk to her this morning. He found her in the kitchen. She was sitting at the far end of the long breakfast table, both hands wrapped around a mug, staring at nothing. She hadn't eaten. A plate of food sat cooling in front of her, untouched. She was wearing a gray sweater 2 sizes too large, sleeves pulled down over her hands, and she had the look of someone who hadn't slept after 3 a.m. and had decided that pretending to be okay was still easier than not. She looked up when Dorian came in. There was a question in her eyes, whether last night counted as an argument, whether she was in trouble for it, whether the rules had changed. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat. "I'm not sending you to the school," he said. The muscles in her jaw unclenched so visibly it was almost painful to watch. "But I need to talk to you about something else, and I need you to listen to all of it before you say anything. Can you do that?" She nodded. Her hands tightened around the mug. He told her about Thorne's report. Not all of it, not the worst of it, not yet, but enough. He told her about Elliot's control over the trust, the psychiatric evaluations, the guardianship. He kept his voice even, his words measured, giving her the information the way you give someone a diagnosis. Clearly, without flinching, because the opposite of clear is not kind. Rowan listened. She didn't move. Her face went from pale to something beyond pale, some shade of gray that didn't have a name. When he finished, silence filled the kitchen like water filling a room. "You found the envelope," she said. "Yes." She nodded slowly, like confirmation of something she'd already calculated. "The note on the photograph," he said. "They're coming. How did you know?" For a moment, he thought she wouldn't answer. She looked down at her mug, at her own hands wrapped around it. "I found a number in the pocket of the housekeeper's apron," she said. "When she forgot it in the laundry room, I looked it up." She paused. "Norcroft Group." Dorian leaned back. "That was how long ago?" 11 days. 11 days she'd been sitting on that. 11 days of sleeping with a kitchen knife and hiding documents behind library books and screaming herself awake at 3 a.m. while knowing, actually knowing, that they had already found her. "Why didn't you tell me?" he said. She looked at him then. Really looked at him, with those eyes that had been emptied and refilled too many times. "Because the last time I told someone they were coming," she said quietly, "that someone called my uncle and told him I was having delusional episodes again." Dorian held her gaze. He didn't look away. He didn't offer her reassurance because she would know it was too easy, and he would know it was insufficient. He just let her see his face, and whatever she read in it seemed to be enough. "Okay," she said, and then, "What happens now?" "Now we make it very difficult for your uncle's family to get anywhere near you. Legally, we challenge the guardianship. Financially, we freeze the trust through litigation. And here, in this building, we lock down the perimeter and we wait. And if the legal route doesn't work fast enough?" It was a direct question. She asked it without wavering. Dorian almost smiled. "Then we move to the next option." "What's the next option?" "I'll let you know when we get there." She looked at him for a long moment, and something shifted in her expression. Not quite trust. She was too careful for trust, too thoroughly trained by damage. But something adjacent to it, the recognition that she was not, for the first time in a very long time, fighting this alone. She looked down at her plate, picked up her fork. She ate. The first problem arrived at noon. His name was Graham Pellerin, and he was Elliot Vale's attorney. He arrived at the Blackthorn gate in a chauffeured car, wearing a suit that cost more than Kessler's monthly salary, carrying a leather briefcase that contained, as he announced through the gate intercom with the polished calm of a man who had done this many times, a formal court summons and a petition for emergency custodial transfer. Kessler called Dorian. Dorian called his own attorney, a woman named Helena Marsh, who had the sharpest legal mind and the most alarming patience of anyone he'd ever retained. "Don't let him on the property," Helena said immediately when Dorian reached her. "Have someone accept service at the gate, document the time and vehicle, get photographs of his identification. I'll have a response filed by end of business today, but we need to move. An emergency custodial petition in this jurisdiction goes to a judge within 48 hours. Can they get the transfer ordered that fast? If their paperwork is in order and the judge is sympathetic..." She paused with the precision of someone choosing their next word carefully. "I need to know everything about the psychiatric evaluations. Names, dates, facilities. and I need whatever you have on the trust structure. You'll have it within the hour. Dorian called Thorne. Thorne called 3 people. By 2 in the afternoon, Helena had the full file. By 4, she called back with a voice that was controlled in the way that expensive lawyers become controlled when they're trying not to alarm you while being alarmed. Dorian, she said, the psychiatric evaluations are extremely well constructed. Whoever Dr. Gale is, he knows how to write documentation that holds up under a first-pass review. The guardianship itself has no procedural errors I can find in a 4-hour review. The petition for custodial transfer is legitimate, and the judge assigned to the 48-hour hearing is Rosalind Wexler. Dorian pulled the name up in his memory. Wexler. She sat on 2 cases involving Elliott Vale's legal entities in the last decade. Both ruled in his favor. I'm not saying she's bought. I'm saying the circumstances are uncomfortable, and we need to be prepared for an unfavorable ruling at the preliminary hearing. What does unfavorable mean in practice? It means a court-ordered transfer of custody within 72 hours. It means the Norcroft people come to your gate with badges and paperwork, and there's a legal framework requiring you to hand her over. And if you don't... Helena didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Dorian stood in his study in the blue late afternoon light and felt the walls of his options narrowing. He'd been in tighter spots. He'd been in situations where the ground had completely disappeared and he'd found a way to stay standing anyway. But those situations had involved assets, territory, money, power, things he understood and had spent his whole life learning to maneuver. This was different. This was a 17-year-old girl who had trusted him with something she'd never trusted anyone with. And the machinery grinding toward her was patient and legal and moving faster than he'd expected. He called Marin. The hearing is in 48 hours, he said. Helena says we might lose the preliminary. Marin was quiet for a second. And if we lose it? Then we have 72 hours before they can legally compel us to release her. He paused. I'm not releasing her. Dorian. Her voice was measured, careful. If you defy a court order, I know what it means. Do you? Because it doesn't just mean legal exposure. It means they come after the entire organization, every legitimate business you've spent 10 years building, every legal operation, every licensed entity. I know what it means, Marin. Silence stretched between them. Is she worth that? Marin asked. It wasn't a cruel question. It was the right question, the necessary one, the question that Dorian had been circling since 6 in the morning. He thought about the basement room in the Vale estate, the mattress on the floor, the bucket in the corner, the deadbolt on the outside of the door. He thought about a girl looking up at his people and asking if they were going to take her somewhere else. He thought about her in the library, bargaining for her own existence with the fluency of someone who'd been doing it for years. Yes, he said. He said it the way he said most things, flat, final, without performance. Marin exhaled slowly. Then we need a better strategy than the courts. I know. I'm working on it. He hung up and looked out the window. The grounds were quiet. The perimeter cameras were running. The guards were in position. Everything looked controlled, and Dorian had been alive long enough to know that when everything looked controlled, it was often the exact moment something was about to come apart. His phone buzzed. Thorne. He picked up. We have a problem, Thorne said. Define it. I put a surveillance team on the Norcroft Group's local movements. 2 of their people have been stationary in a vehicle 3 blocks from the Blackthorn East Gate since last night. They're not moving because they're not here to take her yet. They're watching ingress and egress points, learning your patterns. Dorian's jaw tightened. They're planning the extraction. Yes. They'll wait for the court order, use it as cover, and move the moment it's signed. Clean, legal, documented. Thorne's voice didn't change pitch. But there's something else. The vehicle registration on the surveillance car traces back through 2 shell entities to a holding company in Grayfield. Guess who sits on the board of that holding company? Dorian already knew. Dr. Merritt Gale, he said, the man who wrote 3 psychiatric evaluations declaring your girl incompetent is directly financially connected to the company that's about to extract her. Thorne paused. That's not a coincidence, Dorian. That's conspiracy. If we can prove it, the guardianship falls apart. Can we prove it? Give me 18 hours and a direct line to your forensic accountant. 18 hours. The hearing was in 48. It was workable. Barely. Do it, Dorian said. And Thorne? Yeah. If anything changes on that surveillance vehicle, if they move, if they shift position, if anyone gets out to stretch their legs, I want to know immediately. Understood. Dorian hung up. He stood in his study and built it all out in his head, the timeline, the dependencies, the moving pieces, and where they intersected. It was what he was good at, seeing the whole board while other people were still counting their own pieces. The problem was that this board had a piece he hadn't accounted for. He found Rowan at dusk. She was in the east wing corridor, standing at the window at the far end, watching the grounds go dark. She had her arms wrapped around herself and she was very still, in the way she got still when she was thinking hard about something she wasn't going to say. Dorian stopped beside her. They both looked out the window at the darkening lawn, the tree line, the distant wall. They were at the gate today, she said. It wasn't a question. An attorney with paperwork. She nodded, processing. There's a hearing in 48 hours, he said. A judge will decide whether the custody transfer is ordered. She turned to look at him. Her face in the fading light was older than 17. Too old. The kind of old that comes from specific damage over specific years. And if the judge orders it? He met her eyes. I told you, he said, no one is taking you anywhere. She held his gaze for a long moment. Then she looked back out the window. Her breath fogged against the glass. They got to the last judge, she said quietly. The one who signed the original guardianship. Elliot had photographs of him at a party he shouldn't have attended. His wife didn't know. She paused. My uncle doesn't leave things to chance. He already has something on Wexler. I can almost promise you that. Dorian looked at the side of her face, at the certainty there, at the years of observation and pattern recognition that had kept her alive inside a system designed to consume her. How do you know about Wexler? He said. She almost smiled. Almost. You're not the only one who makes calls at 6 a.m. He stared at her. And for the first time in this entire situation, Dorian Voss felt something he hadn't expected to feel. He felt outpaced by a 17-year-old girl with no resources, no allies, and no weapons except the extraordinary, terrible intelligence she'd developed in order to survive. He was still processing that when his phone went off. Thorne. He answered immediately. What is it? The surveillance vehicle moved. Thorne's voice was stripped down, operational. Both Norcroft operatives exited the car 11 minutes ago. They didn't approach the gate. They went around the block to the service road on the north side. Dorian was already moving. The hearing is in 48 hours, he said. They don't have a court order yet. No, Thorne said. They don't. The implication settled like cold water. They weren't waiting for the court order. They were going in tonight. Dorian was already moving before the call ended. He hit the hallway at a pace that wasn't quite running. Running was for men who'd lost control of the situation, and Dorian refused to cede that ground even now. But his stride ate distance fast, and he was talking before Kessler even had time to register that something had changed. North Service Road, 2 Norcroft operatives on foot, seal the gate, rotate 3 men to the north perimeter wall, and get someone on the roof with eyes on the tree line. Kessler was already moving, one hand to his earpiece. What's their equipment? Unknown. Assume everything. He turned back to Rowan. She was still at the window, and she'd heard enough. He could tell by the way she'd gone completely still. Not the animal stillness of fear, but something more deliberate, calculated. The stillness of someone running numbers. Come with me, he said. She didn't hesitate. She followed him down the corridor, down the main stairs, through the kitchen and into the lower level where the Manor's reinforced safe room sat behind a panel in the wine cellar wall. He'd had it built 6 years ago after a rival had sent a car bomb through the front gate. He'd never used it. He'd always hoped that was because the threat of it was sufficient deterrent. He pulled the panel open. Rowan stopped walking. I'm not going in there, she said. He turned. She was standing 3 feet behind him, arms at her sides, looking at the room beyond the panel with an expression that was completely unreadable except for one thing: the slight whitening of her knuckles where her hands had formed fists. It's reinforced, steel door, independent ventilation, hardline communication. "It's a room with a lock," she said, "and the lock is on your side." The words landed precisely where she'd aimed them. He felt them hit. She wasn't being irrational. She was being entirely rational. The last room someone had locked her in had been a basement with a bucket and a mattress and no windows, and the people who held the key had called it care. "Rowan, I'll stay close. I'll stay low. But I'm not going in a locked room." He looked at her for a long moment. Outside, somewhere on the north perimeter, two men were moving through the dark with unknown equipment and a mandate to take her. The hearing was 46 hours away. The forensic accountant was still building the financial case. Helena was filing counterpapers. Everything was in motion, and every single piece of it depended on Rowan Vale being in this building and not in the back of a car. "Stay behind me," he said. "Don't move unless I tell you to move." She nodded, once. Sharp. He closed the panel. The next 40 minutes were controlled chaos. Kessler's team intercepted the two Norcroft operatives at the base of the north wall. They had bolt cutters, a signal jammer the size of a brick, and laminated credentials that were technically legitimate, issued through a subsidiary of a private security contractor that had filed the right paperwork with the right municipal licensing board. They were doing nothing illegal yet. They were simply two men standing near a wall in the dark, with professional equipment and no good explanation for being there. Kessler detained them on the grounds anyway. Private property, clear signage, no authorization on file. He was polite about it, professionally polite. The kind of polite that comes with a hand resting on the grip of a sidearm. Dorian watched the camera feed from the study. Rowan stood behind him, slightly to the left, close enough that he could hear her breathing, steady, deliberate. The breathing of someone who had learned to control their own body in high-stress situations, the way most people learn to tie their shoes. "They'll have more," she said. "I know. These two are a probe. They want to see how fast you respond, where your gaps are, how many men you have on which side." She paused. "My uncle doesn't spend money inefficiently. If he hired Norcroft, he's already done a full reconnaissance." Dorian looked at her sideways. "You've thought about this," he said. "I've been thinking about this since I was 14. He turned back to the screen. The two Norcroft men were being walked to the gate, calm as businessmen who'd taken a wrong turn. Their car was still parked on the service road. They'd be back in it within 5 minutes, calling in their assessment. By midnight, whoever was running their operation would have a full picture of Blackthorn's response time and deployment pattern. "How many men does your uncle have?" Dorian asked. "Access to, or personally loyal?" "Both." She thought for a moment. "He has 4 people who will do anything he asks without documentation. He's used them before, once to intimidate a witness in a civil case, once to remove someone's car from a parking structure and make it look like a repossession. Small, clean, deniable things." She paused. "But if he's going to take me out of a fortified estate belonging to Dorian Voss, he's not using his own people. He's fully contracted out." "How many from Norcroft?" "Depends on what he told them about you." She said it flatly. "If he told them the truth, that you run an organized crime operation with armed security, they'll have at minimum 8 to 10 field operatives, probably more." Dorian was quiet. "You've been preparing for this," he said. "Not an accusation, almost something else." "I've been preparing for this since the day they put me in that room," she said. "I didn't know where I'd be or what resources I'd have or who'd be standing next to me. I just knew it was coming." He looked at her then, really looked at her, the way he sometimes forgot to look at people because looking took time and vulnerability, and he'd trained both out of himself decades ago. What he saw was a girl who had been systematically stripped of every conventional resource and had responded by building something else entirely. Something internal and difficult to see, and almost impossible to break. He turned back to the screens. "Get some sleep," he said. "We have 46 hours before the hearing. I need you sharp." She left the study without argument. He didn't sleep at all. The call from Helena came at 7:14 the next morning. He was on his second coffee, standing at the window watching the morning come up over the east wall. Gray and flat, the sky the color of old concrete. The grounds were quiet. The Norcroft vehicle had gone at midnight and hadn't reappeared. The perimeter was intact. The guards were rotated, rested, and in position. "Tell me something I want to hear," he said when he answered. Helena's pause was a fraction too long. The forensic accountant found the transfers, she said. 11 years of systematic withdrawal from the Vale Trust, routed through 4 shell companies in 3 jurisdictions. Total extraction is approximately $29 million over that period. That's good. It is. But Dorian, the guardianship documentation, I've been through all of it now, every page. It was filed correctly, executed correctly, and there is a valid court stamp on every relevant document. To overturn it, we need to prove fraud in the original psychiatric evaluations, which means we need Dr. Gale. Thorne has a financial connection between Gale and the Norcroft Holding Company. A financial connection isn't fraud. It's suggestive, but a skilled attorney will argue that Gale's professional conclusions are independent of his business associations. We need something direct. A prior instance of falsified documentation, a patient who can testify that Gale provided a false evaluation, communications between Gale and Elliot Vale that show coordination prior to Rowan's evaluation. She paused. We need the inside of his practice. How long to get it? Legitimately, months. A subpoena for medical records has to go through 3 review layers given the privacy protections involved, by which time the custody transfer will already be not legitimately, Dorian said. Silence. I'm going to pretend you didn't say that, Helena said. And I'm going to pretend you didn't hear it. How long do I have before the hearing? 38 hours. That's enough. He hung up. He was reaching for his phone to call Thorne when the door to the study opened. It wasn't Kessler. It wasn't Marin. It was Rowan. She was dressed, hair pulled back, and she was holding a manila folder that he had never seen before. Not the envelope from the library. Something new. Something thicker. She set it on his desk without a word. He looked at her, then at the folder. He opened it. Inside was a printed email chain, 47 pages. The header on the first email showed a sent date 3 years ago. The sender address was a personal account he didn't recognize. The recipient was Elliot Vale's private email, which Thorne had identified in his initial report. He read the first 3 lines and went completely still. The emails were from Dr. Merritt Gale, not correspondence about Rowan specifically, about a methodology, about how to structure psychiatric documentation for cases involving contested estates and guardianship disputes, about the specific language that made evaluations court-resistant, about the judges in 3 jurisdictions who had accepted Gale's testimony without challenge in the past, about the fee structure for what Gale called extended consultation. It was a template, a blueprint. Gale had done this before, not just for the Vales, for at least 4 other families named in the chain, all in similar situations: contested inheritances, disabled relatives, minors with assets. Gale was running a service, a systematic, profitable, and almost entirely invisible service that put people away so other people could take their money. Dorian set the folder down. He looked at Rowan. "Where did you get this?" he said. "I took it from Elliot's home office," she said. "The night before your people found me." He stared at her. "I'd been planning to leave for 3 weeks," she said. Her voice was steady, matter-of-fact, the voice of someone describing a grocery run. "I knew they were going to file the next evaluation. I knew what it would say. I needed something to take with me, something that couldn't be explained away." She nodded at the folder. "That took me 4 hours to find and print. I hid it in my jacket lining when I left." Dorian sat back in his chair. He thought about the night his team found her. The mattress, the bucket, the deadbolt. The girl looking up and asking if they were going to take her somewhere else. And she had walked out of that room with 47 pages of criminal evidence sewn into her jacket. "You didn't tell me you had this," he said. "I didn't know if I could trust you with it." "And now?" She met his eyes. "Now I think you need it more than I need to hold on to it." He picked up the phone and called Thorne. "I have the evidence on Gale," he said. "Come to the manor, and bring whoever you need to make copies that can't be challenged." The rest of that morning moved fast. Thorne arrived at 9 with a document specialist. Helena arrived at 10 and spent 40 minutes with the email chain before calling Dorian into the kitchen where Rowan was eating breakfast with the careful focus of someone who was trying very hard to act normal. "This is enough," Helena said. She kept her voice low, but Rowan could obviously hear her. and all three of them knew it. Combined with the financial transfers, this is enough to challenge the guardianship at the hearing. It won't be automatic. Wexler will still have to rule on the preliminary motion, but the evidentiary foundation is solid enough that even a compromised judge will have difficulty ignoring it without significant exposure to herself. Dorian nodded. "File it," he said. "Everything. The transfers, the Gale chain, the Norcroft financial connection. File it all." Helena nodded and left the kitchen. Thorne followed. Dorian remained. He looked at Rowan. She was eating toast, looking at the table. "You should have told me about the emails the first week," he said. She looked up. "Would you have believed me?" He opened his mouth, closed it. She went back to her toast. He stood in the kitchen for another moment, and then he said something he almost never said. Not because it cost him ego, though it did, but because it came with the specific weight of someone who understood what it meant to be wrong about a situation. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the school, for not understanding sooner." She didn't look up, but her jaw worked for a moment, chewing something that wasn't toast. "Okay," she said quietly. It was enough. The next 26 hours were the kind of hours that stretched. The legal machine was in motion. Helena's firm had filed a 40-page countermotion with attached evidence that landed in Judge Wexler's clerk's office at 1:15 p.m. Thorne's team had copies of everything stored in 3 separate secure locations. The forensic accountant was preparing a condensed exhibit for the hearing. Everything was moving, everything was in order, and Dorian Voss stood in the center of it all and felt the specific, particular dread of a man who has done everything right and still knows the ground under his feet is not entirely solid. The feeling proved correct at 6:47 p.m. Kessler appeared in the doorway of the study. His face was arranged in the careful neutrality of someone carrying bad news who has been trained not to show reaction. "You need to see something," he said. He handed Dorian a tablet. On the screen was a security camera feed, not Blackthorn's system, but a feed from the camera Thorne had placed on the street outside Helena Marsh's office building. The feed showed the building's parking structure entrance. It showed Helena's car, a gray sedan, plates he recognized, being pulled out by 2 men in a vehicle recovery truck at 5:53 p.m. It showed those men driving it away. It was a repossession, perfectly documented, authorized by a lien filed that morning against Helena's firm through a financial instrument Dorian had never seen connected to her before. "Staged," he said. "Thorne is pulling the lien records now," Kessler said. "But yes, almost certainly." Dorian set the tablet down. "Where's Helena?" "She left the office at 6. Normal route home. Kessler stopped. Dorian looked at him. "She hasn't arrived," Kessler said. "Her home security system shows no entry. Her phone goes to voicemail." The room got very quiet. Dorian stood absolutely still for 5 seconds. He was doing what he always did when the board changed suddenly, mapping it. The veils had moved on Helena, not the girl, not the manor. They'd gone after his attorney, the one person whose presence at the hearing tomorrow morning was essential to presenting the evidence that could collapse the guardianship case. It was elegant. He had to give Elliot Vale that much. You don't attack the fortress. You remove the person who was going to win the legal argument. Without Helena, tomorrow's hearing proceeded with a substitute counsel who hadn't spent 2 days immersed in the case, who didn't know the evidence the way Helena knew it, who would be walking into a courtroom against a legal team that had been preparing this particular maneuver for 3 years. Without Helena, the 47-page email chain and the financial transfer evidence went into a hearing that was already running before a judge who had ruled in Elliot Vale's favor twice before. Without Helena, they lost the preliminary motion. Without the preliminary motion, the custody transfer was ordered. Within 72 hours, the Norcroft people came to the gate with a court order, and Dorian had a choice between handing Rowan over or committing a federal offense that dismantled everything he'd built. He picked up his phone, called Helena's personal line. Voicemail. He called her home line. Rang through. He called the emergency number she'd given him 3 years ago when she first came to work for him. A number that went to a separate device she kept for situations that didn't have protocol. It rang twice. Someone answered. Not Helena. A male voice, unhurried, with the particular smoothness of a man who has rehearsed what he's about to say and has decided that performance is unnecessary because the facts are sufficient. "Mr. Voss," the voice said, "Helena is with us. She's unharmed and will remain that way provided the next 24 hours proceed without incident. I think you understand what we're asking. The hearing tomorrow goes forward. You don't appear. The girl is transferred, and Helena goes home." Dorian said nothing. "You have until midnight to confirm," the voice said. "We'll accept your silence as agreement." The line went dead. Dorian set the phone on the desk. He looked at his hands. He turned the situation over in his head the way he turned everything over, methodically, without panic, with the cold operational clarity that had kept him alive and functional for 20 years in a life that killed most men faster. The problem was clear. He could see every angle of it. If he handed Rowan over, Helena came home and Rowan went into a system that would consume her. The Vales would have her declared incompetent within the month, institutionalized within 3. And by the time any independent legal action could be brought, the money would be gone, the documentation would be impenetrable, and Rowan Vale would be a name in a medical file in a facility where the visiting hours were controlled by the people who had put her there. If he didn't hand Rowan over, he had one night to build a new legal strategy without his attorney, present it to a potentially compromised judge in the morning, and simultaneously find Helena without triggering whatever protocol the voice on the phone had in place to ensure she didn't come home safely. He had no good options. He had one option that was less catastrophic than the others. He stood up. He walked out of the study and down the hall to the east wing, and he knocked on Rowan's door. She opened it immediately. She was still dressed. She hadn't been sleeping. Her eyes went to his face and read it the way she read everything, fast, accurately, without flinching. "They took someone," she said. "My attorney." She absorbed this. Her jaw tightened for a moment, a small, controlled expression of anger that she immediately smoothed back out. "They're trying to make you choose," she said. "Yes." "Between your attorney and me." "Yes." She looked at him steadily. In the hallway light, her face was very calm, and that calm was the most frightening thing he'd seen since he opened Thorne's first call that morning, because he knew what it meant. He'd seen it before, in soldiers and in survivors, in people who had been pushed past the point where fear was useful and had found something else on the other side. "There's another option," she said. "Tell me." She stepped back from the door. On the desk behind her was a laptop, his spare, which she'd apparently been using, and on the screen was a document he recognized. The 47-page email chain. She'd been working through it again. And beside it, handwritten on a legal pad in her cramped, precise handwriting, were notes. Pages of them. Cross-referenced. Organized by date, by name, by... She stepped back from the door and let him in. The legal pad had 40 pages of notes. Maybe more. She'd been working through the email chain the way a surgeon works through a procedure. Methodically, without sentiment, with the specific economy of someone who has learned to think under pressure, because pressure was the only condition she'd ever been given to think in. Dorian crossed to the desk and looked at the first page. She had organized every email in the Gale chain by the name of the victim. Not by date, not by legal case number, not by jurisdiction. By name. 12 people across 4 states. Some of them minors like Rowan, some of them elderly relatives with contested estates. All of them declared incompetent by Merritt Gale. All of them with assets that had subsequently transferred to family members who had retained Gale through Elliott Vale's network. Beside each name, she had written what she could find from the email chain about their current status. Institution, facility, private care home. 2 of them she had marked with a single word that sat on the page like a stone. Deceased. "These people," she said from behind him, "they're witnesses. Or they were. The ones still alive. If we can reach them, if we can get their own documentation, their own records, Gale's pattern becomes undeniable. 1 false evaluation is professional misconduct. 12 is a criminal enterprise." Dorian turned from the desk. She was standing with her arms crossed, not in the defensive posture she usually carried, but in the posture of someone who has made a decision and is waiting for the other person to catch up. "The hearing is in 14 hours, he said. "I know. We don't have time to contact 12 witnesses. We don't need 12, we need 2. 2 corroborated testimonies from other Gale victims, combined with the financial records and the email chain, And the guardianship argument collapses regardless of who the judge is. She paused. I found 3 people in this chain who had attorneys of record who were not connected to Elliot's network. That means they had independent counsel who was already suspicious of Gale. If those attorneys still exist, if their clients are still reachable, Rowan. He said it quietly, not dismissively. Where are you getting this? She looked at him for a moment. 4 years of reading every legal document they put in front of me and figuring out what was wrong with it. 3 years of understanding exactly how my uncle works. She held his gaze. I have been planning to fight this since before I knew you existed. I just didn't have the resources. He stood in the middle of her room in a criminal fortress at 8 o'clock at night with Helena Marsh missing and a court hearing in 14 hours, and a 17-year-old girl who had just handed him a legal strategy built from 4 years of solitary preparation, and he felt something recalibrate inside him. He took the legal pad. Get your laptop, he said. We're working through the night. He called Thorne at 8:23. He called Thorne's research deputy at 8:31. He had Kessler reach out to a private investigator in 2 separate cities by 9 o'clock. By 9:45, they had located attorneys of record for 2 of Rowan's 3 identified cases. One of those attorneys, a woman named Patricia Osei, who had practiced family law in Carver County for 22 years, answered her personal cell at 10:07 p.m. on what appeared to be the first call she'd received about Merritt Gale from outside her own case file. Dorian handed the phone to Rowan. She took it without hesitation. He listened to one side of a conversation that lasted 19 minutes. Rowan spoke carefully, precisely, without desperation. She laid out what she had. She asked what Osei had. She listened. She made notes. When she hung up, she looked at the legal pad and wrote 2 words at the top of a new page. She has more. Osei had her own documentation, a prior Gale evaluation on a client of hers from 8 years ago, before the Vales had apparently refined the process, in which Gale's language had been substantially less polished and contained phrases that directly mirrored language from Elliot Vale's own communications about that case. Osei had never been able to get a judge to take it seriously as evidence. She'd been sitting on it for 8 years. She had been sitting on it for 8 years waiting for someone else to find what she'd found. She was willing to file an emergency affidavit. By midnight, Thorne had the affidavit drafted, reviewed, and transmitted to a notary in Osei's city who operated a 24-hour service for exactly this kind of situation. By 12:40 a.m., the signed document was in Helena's associate's hands. A young attorney named Devlin Marsh, Helena's nephew, who had joined the firm 2 years ago and who Dorian had called at 11 p.m. and spoken to for 40 minutes about what was required and what was at stake. Devlin was 28. He had never argued an emergency motion before a circuit judge. He was also, as Dorian assessed him over the phone, rigidly principled, genuinely furious about what he was hearing, and smart enough to understand that the quality of the evidence was doing most of the work. "You'll be in that courtroom tomorrow," Dorian said, "with everything we have." "Yes, sir," Devlin said. "Don't call me sir, and don't lose." He hung up. Rowan was at the desk, still working, cross-referencing names from the email chain against public court records that Thorne's deputy was pulling in real time. She had a cup of coffee she hadn't touched going cold beside the laptop. Her handwriting on the legal pad had gotten tighter, more compressed, the way handwriting gets when the mind is running faster than the hand. Dorian sat in the chair across from the desk. "You should sleep," he said. "So should you." "I don't sleep." "Neither do I." She didn't look up from the screen. "Dorian? Helena. Do you know where she is?" He'd been working the problem in the background all night. Thorne had 3 teams running trace protocols on every known Norcroft asset in the city. He had 2 independent contacts making discreet inquiries through channels that didn't intersect with anything legal. The voice on Helena's emergency phone had given him until midnight to confirm agreement. He hadn't called back. Midnight had passed at 43 minutes ago. "Not yet," he said. She finally looked up. "If they hurt her because of me, they won't," he said. "She's more valuable to them unhurt. The moment she's harmed, what they're doing becomes criminal in a way that no amount of legal maneuvering can contain. They know that." She held his eyes for a moment, calculating whether to believe him. deciding apparently that the logic was sound even if the certainty wasn't. She went back to the screen. At 2:17 a.m., Thorne called. "We found Helena." Dorian stood. "Where?" "Extended stay hotel, 12 blocks east, room 114. She's unharmed. 2 Norcroft people outside her door. Another in the lobby. They're not restraining her physically. The door isn't locked. They're just present, visible. The implication is sufficient. Can we get her out?" Define get her out. "Without triggering whatever failsafe they have in place." Thorne was quiet for a moment. "If we move on the hotel before the hearing, they'll know immediately that you didn't comply. Whatever they plan to do in response to non-compliance happens before the hearing starts." "Yes." Dorian turned this over. Through the doorway, he could see Rowan at the desk, lamplight on her face, pencil moving across the legal pad. "What time does the hearing start?" Thorne asked. 9 a.m. "It's 2:17. If we wait until 7 a.m. to move on the hotel, give their team as little response time as possible before the hearing. If something goes wrong at the hotel at 7 a.m., Helena doesn't make it to the courtroom by 9. Devlin is already prepared." "Devlin is 28 and has never done this before." Silence. "Dorian," Thorne said carefully, "there's one more thing." The way he said it was specific. The particular weight of a man preparing to deliver information that changes the architecture of everything prior. "The 2 Norcroft people outside Helena's door," Thorne said. "I ran their credentials. One of them traces back through a staffing agency that has provided contract personnel to 3 of your subsidiary operations in the last 4 years." He paused. "The other one has a prior employment record. He worked for you, directly. Security detail, 18 months ago, left on good terms." The air in the room shifted. "His name," Dorian said, "Ren Daly." Dorian stood completely still. Ren Daly had been on his payroll for 14 months. Not inner circle, he hadn't been trusted at that level, but solid, reliable, professional. He'd been part of the rotation on 2 sensitive operations. He'd been inside this building. He'd walked these halls, these corridors, sat at the kitchen table, known the patrol patterns and the camera positions and the response protocols. He had left Dorian's employment 7 months ago. Family reasons, he'd said. A move, an amicable parting. Severance paid. References provided. 7 months ago. 2 months before Dorian's team found Rowan in that basement. Dorian set the phone against his chest. He thought about it with the cold, dismantling clarity that was his most reliable tool. Timeline, sequence, causality. Norcroft had been hired by Elliot Vale. Norcroft had placed Ren Daly in a position where he could walk away from Dorian's employ without suspicion and join their contractor roster. Daly had left with institutional knowledge. Patrol patterns, shift schedules, camera blind spots, the specific layout of the East Wing where Rowan slept. The probe at the north wall last night. 2 men, out quickly, clean, like men who'd been told exactly what they'd find and where, because one of the men running the operation had spent 14 months learning it from the inside. "Thorne," he said into the phone. "Yeah." "The North Perimeter probe last night. Was Daly part of it?" Papers rustling, a pause. "Can't confirm, but the timing." "Yes," Dorian said. "The timing." He hung up. He stood in the corridor outside Rowan's room for 60 seconds, running the full implication. Then he went back in. She looked up from the desk and read his face in 2 seconds flat. "What happened?" she said. "Someone I employed walked your uncle's team into this building's security architecture," he said. "He knows our patrol patterns. He knows the camera positions. He knows the East Wing layout." She didn't flinch. She absorbed it the way she absorbed everything, completely, immediately, without the luxury of denial. "So the perimeter isn't what you think it is," she said. "No. They can come in cleaner than last night." "Yes." She looked at the window, then at the door, then at him. "When?" she said. "I don't know. Before the hearing, if they want to preempt the legal argument. After it, if they get the court order and want to add legitimate cover." He paused. "Either way, tonight is the highest risk window." She stood up from the desk. She closed the laptop. She picked up the legal pad and held it against her chest. "Then we don't stay here," she said. He looked at her. If they know the building, she said, then the building isn't safe. You move me somewhere they don't have a map of. She held his gaze steadily. You know how to do that. She was right. He did know how to do that. He had safe houses, 3 of them within 20 minutes of the manor, all under names that weren't connected to Blackthorn or any of his registered entities. He hadn't used them in years because the manor's security had always been sufficient. Now sufficient wasn't the word he'd use. I don't love moving you in the middle of the night, he said. I don't love being in a building where someone has the floor plan and a mandate to take me, she said. He called Kessler. Get a car, no Blackthorn plates, 1 driver, no additional personnel, service exit on the south side, 10 minutes. Where are we going? Kessler said. Heron Street, the unit on the 4th floor. He turned to Rowan. Pack what matters. You have 8 minutes. She was already moving. They left through the service exit at 2:41 a.m. Dorian, Rowan, and Kessler, in a car that had no connection to anyone named Voss, moving through streets that were empty in the specific way that cities get empty in the hours before dawn. Not quiet, exactly, but thinned out, stripped of cover. The buildings went by dark and flat. Rain had started again, light and persistent. Rowan sat in the back seat beside him. She had a bag on her lap. The legal pad was inside it. She was looking out the window with her face turned slightly away from him, and he could see the reflection of streetlights moving across her eyes in the glass. In the morning, she said quietly, the hearing. Yes. If Devlin loses the preliminary motion, he won't. If he does, she turned from the window. You can't defy a court order, Dorian. I won't let you do that for me. You'd lose everything you've built. He looked at her. Everything I've built, he said, was built on the principle that when someone comes for what's mine, I don't step aside and let them have it. She held his eyes for a moment. I'm not yours, she said. Not combatively, just precisely. No, he agreed, but you're under my protection, and that's the same thing to me. She turned back to the window. The car moved through the rain. Heron Street was a residential block in a part of the city that had been commercial 20 years ago and had gentrified badly and incompletely, leaving behind a mix of renovated apartments and stubborn old buildings that hadn't decided yet what they wanted to be. The 4th floor unit was spare, 2 bedrooms, a kitchen, windows that looked out over a street with reasonable sightlines in both directions. Dorian had bought it through an entity that existed solely on paper in another state. Nobody knew about it, including, he was fairly certain, Wren Daly. He set Rowan up in the 2nd bedroom. She sat on the bed without complaint, the bag on her lap, looking at nothing. Sleep, he said. I'll try. He started to turn. She spoke. My father, she said. He stopped. Nathaniel, my father. Her voice was even, deliberately even. You said the report listed his death as an accident, car into a lake. Yes. Did Thorne look into it? He flagged it. He hasn't had time to go deeper. She nodded slowly. Her hands moved on the bag, fingers pressing the canvas. I was 11 when he died, she said. I remember the night they told me. Elliot came to my school. He sat across from me in the headmaster's office, and he held my hands and cried. She paused. He's not a man who cries easily. I remember thinking that it seemed like practice. She swallowed. I've thought about it for 6 years, whether it was practice. Dorian held the doorframe. He held it because he needed something to hold. We'll find out, he said. Yes, she said, we will. He left her there and went to the main room where Kessler was positioned by the door. He stood at the window and looked out at Heron Street, at the rain on the pavement and the blank windows across the way, and he built it all out in his head one more time. The hearing at 9. Devlin and the affidavit and the financial records. Helena in the hotel room with Norcroft people outside her door. Wren Daly, somewhere, with a floor plan of Blackthorn in his head. Elliot Vale, waiting. His phone buzzed. Thorne. He answered. The hearing schedule was updated 20 minutes ago, Thorne said. Judge Wexler filed an administrative order at 2:55 a.m. The hearing has been moved. Moved when? Not rescheduled. Moved up. It now starts at 7 a.m. Dorian looked at his watch. 3:08 a.m. Less than 4 hours. They know we've been building the counter case, he said. Yes, they're trying to get to a ruling before Devlin can present the full evidentiary package. Wexler would have the authority to rule on the preliminary motion with partial documentation if our side isn't ready. Dorian turned from the window. His mind was already restructuring the timeline, finding the new edges of it, identifying what was movable and what wasn't. Wake Devlin, he said. Get him the complete package within the hour, and Thorne. Helena. We move on the hotel at 5 a.m., not 7. 5. That gives them 90 minutes to respond before the hearing. I know, but if we don't get Helena to that courtroom, we go in with Devlin alone and hope the evidence is enough. He stopped. And get me everything Thorne has on Nathaniel Vale's accident, tonight. Whatever exists. He hung up and turned. Rowan was standing in the hallway. She had her bag still, and she was fully dressed. She hadn't slept. She'd never intended to sleep. She'd been listening to every word. He looked at her. She looked at him. 4 hours, she said. Less. She nodded. She walked past him to the kitchen table, set down the bag, took out the legal pad, and opened it to a fresh page. Then we work, she said. They worked. At 4:55 a.m., Kessler and 2 men Dorian trusted more than anyone on the planet moved on the extended stay hotel on Grayfield East. They went in through the service entrance, up the freight elevator, and into the 4th floor corridor from the stairwell end, coming from the direction opposite the room, behind the 2 Norcroft people who were positioned facing the elevator bank. The lobby man was handled first, quietly, by a 3rd operative who had been sitting in the hotel bar for 2 hours nursing a coffee and reading a newspaper. Kessler reached Helena's door at 5:03 a.m. He knocked twice, paused, knocked once more. The door opened. Helena Marsh stood in the doorway in yesterday's clothes, hair pulled back, eyes alert in the way that eyes get when someone has been awake all night running contingencies. She looked at Kessler, looked past him at the empty corridor, and said, "Tell me we have the affidavit." "We have it," Kessler said. "And more. Can you walk?" "I've been walking since I was 9 months old," she said, and picked up her briefcase from just inside the door. They were in a car heading for the courthouse at 5:11 a.m. At 5:47 a.m., Dorian's phone rang. Unknown number. He answered. The same voice as before, the unhurried male voice, but something had changed in it. A tightening, barely perceptible, like a man who has just discovered that the room he was standing in has fewer walls than he thought. "You moved the girl," the voice said. "I move things frequently," Dorian said. "It's how I've stayed in business." "You didn't comply." "No." A pause. "You understand what we're authorized to do." "Tell me what you think you're authorized to do," Dorian said. His voice was flat, cold, stripped of everything except the precision of a man who has been in rooms like this, metaphorically, literally, and has always been the last one standing. "Because I want to be very clear about the distance between what you think you can do and what will actually happen to you and every person associated with your operation if you take one more step in a direction I haven't given you permission to take." Silence. "The hearing is in 1 hour and 13 minutes, Dorian continued. "My attorney will be there. The evidence will be there. And the people your employer has been destroying for years are going to have their names said out loud in a courtroom for the first time." He paused. "You might want to think about which side of that you want to be standing on when it's over." He hung up. 6:51 a.m. The courthouse was a gray stone building 12 blocks from Heron Street. Classical facade, broad steps, the kind of architecture designed to make individuals feel small in relation to institutions. Devlin Marsh was already inside, at the plaintiff's table, his case organized in manila folders with the rigid precision of a young man who had spent the night terrified and channeled every bit of that terror into preparation. Helena arrived at 6:58. She set her briefcase on the table beside her nephew, squeezed his shoulder once, and opened the top folder. Dorian arrived at 7:02. He sat in the gallery, 3rd row, and said nothing to anyone. He was in a dark suit that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he sat with the particular stillness of a man who has made his moves and is now watching the board to see what comes back. Rowan sat beside him. She wore a dark blue jacket he hadn't seen before, one that made her look older than 17 and younger than everything she'd been through. Her back was straight, her hands were in her lap. She was looking at the front of the courtroom with the focused calm of someone who has been waiting for this room for years. Judge Rosalind Wexler entered at 7:06. She was 61, silver-haired, with the precise carriage of a woman who had been the most powerful person in every room she'd entered for the past 2 decades. She sat. She arranged her papers. She looked at the plaintiff's table, where Helena and Devlin were positioned with their evidence. She looked at the defendant's table, where Graham Pellerin and 2 associates sat with their own case, dense and polished, and 3 years in the making. She looked at the gallery. Her eyes found Dorian for a fraction of a second, held, moved on. "We are here on an emergency petition for custodial transfer in the matter of Vale versus Vale," she said. "Given the volume of late-filed documentation from the respondent, I'm going to begin by—" The courtroom doors opened. Everyone turned. A man Dorian didn't recognize walked in. He was carrying a badge and a document envelope, and he walked directly to the clerk's desk, bypassed the normal procedure, and handed the envelope to the clerk with the specific economy of someone operating under a mandate that supersedes courtroom decorum. The clerk looked at the envelope, looked at the badge, stood up and walked the envelope directly to Judge Wexler. Wexler opened it. She read it. Something moved across her face that was not quite visible from the gallery. A tightening around the eyes. A stillness in the jaw. The expression of a person who has just had the ground shift under their feet and is deciding whether anyone can see it. She set the document down. "Counsel," she said. Her voice was perfectly steady. "I need to take a 15-minute recess." Pellerin was on his feet. "Your Honor, the petitioner objects to any—" "Sit down, Mr. Pellerin." The voice that had been controlled became something else for exactly 3 words. Then it was controlled again. 15 minutes. She left the bench. Helena turned in her chair and found Dorian's eyes. Her expression asked a question he didn't have the answer to. He looked at the man who had walked in with the badge. The man had positioned himself near the wall, hands clasped in front of him, watching Pellerin. Dorian leaned close to Rowan. "Do you know what that was?" he said quietly. She was looking at the man by the wall. "No," she said. "But look at Pellerin." Dorian looked. Graham Pellerin was sitting at the defendant's table, and for the first time since this process had begun, his polished professional composure had developed a crack in it, barely visible, a slight rigidity in the shoulders. His hands flat on the table in front of him, unnaturally still. He was afraid. Not of losing the case, of something else. Something that had just walked through those doors in a badge and an envelope, and whatever was inside it had just rearranged the geometry of the next 15 minutes in a way that Pellerin hadn't prepared for. Dorian sat back. His phone buzzed. He looked at the screen under the gallery railing. Thorne. 1 message, 6 words. Nathaniel Vale's car. "We found something." Dorian read the message twice. Nathaniel Vale's car. "We found something." He kept his phone below the gallery railing and typed back 1 word. "What?" The reply took 40 seconds, long enough that he felt it. Break line, severed pre-impact. "We have the original salvage report. Suppressed, misfiled in a county records office in Millhaven. The mechanic who wrote it died 8 months after the accident. Heart attack. He was 39. Dorian sat with that for a moment. The courtroom was buzzing quietly around him, the low murmur of attorneys conferring, clerks moving papers, spectators shifting in their seats during the recess. Graham Pellerin was still at his table, hands flat, jaw tight, looking at the middle distance like a man doing arithmetic that keeps coming out wrong. Beside Dorian, Rowan had read the screen over his arm. He hadn't tried to angle it away. There wasn't a point. She had a right to every word of it. She said nothing for a long moment. Then, "He had him killed." "It looks that way." "My father." Her voice was perfectly controlled. The control of someone who has suspected something for 6 years and has just been told the suspicion was correct, and who has already done most of the grieving that other people do after the confirmation. Elliot had my father killed so the trust would pass to me instead of Nathaniel, and then he had me declared incompetent so he could control the trust himself. Yes. She looked at the front of the courtroom, at the empty bench where Wexler had been sitting. That's not a guardianship case anymore, she said. No, Dorian agreed. That's murder. He looked at the man standing by the wall with the badge. He understood now what the envelope had contained. Thorne had been running multiple parallel tracks: the guardianship evidence, the financial fraud, the Gale conspiracy, and somewhere in that process, someone had pulled a thread that led to Millhaven and a suppressed salvage report and a mechanic who died young of a convenient heart attack. Thorne had friends in certain federal offices who owed him considerations. The envelope was the result of one of those considerations being called in. The man with the badge was not a process server. He was a federal investigator. And whatever was in that envelope had just made Pellerin understand that the case he'd come here to win this morning had become, overnight, something he hadn't been retained to handle and could not ethically continue to represent without personal exposure. The 15 minutes stretched to 22. When Wexler returned to the bench, she looked different. Not dramatically. She was too practiced for drama, but in the specific way that powerful people look different when they've just been shown the edge of something and have decided to step back from it rather than over it. The court has received documentation from a federal investigative authority, she said, pertaining to matters adjacent to this proceeding that fall outside this court's jurisdiction but directly implicate the evidentiary foundation of the petition before me. She looked at Pellerin. Mr. Pellerin, does your client wish to maintain the current petition? Pellerin stood. He straightened his jacket. He did it slowly, the way men do things slowly when they're buying time for a decision they've already made. The petitioner, he said carefully, requests a continuance pending review of new developments. Denied. Wexler said it without inflection. The petition is withdrawn by petitioner's own motion or proceeds to ruling today with current evidence on record. Those are the options. Pellerin looked at the papers in front of him. He looked at the man with the badge by the wall. He looked at Helena, who was watching him with the patient expression of someone watching an opponent realize they've lost 3 moves ago. The petitioner withdraws, Pellerin said. The courtroom didn't erupt. It wasn't that kind of room. But the quality of the silence changed, from the tense, coiled silence of a proceeding in motion to something that had exhaled. Wexler made several notations. She spoke for 4 more minutes in the precise, procedural language of someone building a record that would survive any future challenge. She noted the withdrawal. She noted the pending federal matter. She noted that the existing guardianship order was suspended, pending the outcome of the federal investigation and a full evidentiary review by an independent family court authority. Suspended. Not dissolved. Not yet. But suspended was enough. For today, suspended was everything. When the gavel came down, Dorian felt Rowan go still beside him. Not the held-breath stillness of fear. Something new. Something he hadn't seen from her before. The stillness of a person who has been braced for impact for so long that the absence of it takes a moment to recognize. He didn't say anything. He let her have the moment. She exhaled slowly through her nose. Her hands, which had been pressed flat against her thighs since the hearing began, opened. Her fingers spread and then relaxed. A small thing. An enormous thing. Helena was at their side within 2 minutes, Devlin half a step behind her, both of them with the controlled energy of attorneys who want to debrief immediately, but are reading the room well enough to know this is not the moment. The federal matter takes precedence now, Helena said quietly to Dorian. The guardianship suspension holds while their investigation runs, which, given what I understand they have, will not take long. How long? Dorian said. Weeks, maybe less. The financial fraud is documented, and the Gale conspiracy has enough corroborating evidence from Osei's affidavit that the psychiatric evaluations will be voided. Once those fall, the original guardianship has no legal foundation. She paused. And if what you're telling me about Nathaniel Vale's accident is substantiated, it will be, Dorian said. Helena looked at Rowan for a moment. A long moment. The look of a woman who has spent a career navigating systems that were supposed to protect people and frequently didn't, looking at a person those systems had failed for 6 consecutive years. I'm sorry it took this long, Helena said. It wasn't the language of professional courtesy. It was something simpler and harder to say. Rowan looked at her. "You're here now," she said. They left the courthouse at 8:41 a.m. The morning had come up clear and cold, the rain from the night before leaving the steps damp and the air sharp. Dorian walked beside Rowan down the broad stone steps to the street where Kessler was waiting with the car, and neither of them spoke, and the silence between them was comfortable in the specific way that silence becomes comfortable between people who have been through something together that doesn't require narration. Elliot Vale was arrested at 11:15 that morning. Dorian wasn't there for it, but Thorne sent him the details with his customary brevity. Federal agents at the Grayfield estate. Elliot in the breakfast room when they came in. His wife, Sylvia, who had apparently understood for some time that the architecture of her marriage was built on fraudulent ground, sat at the table with her coffee and did not stand when her husband was taken out. She called her own attorney 20 minutes later. Dr. Merritt Gale was arrested at his practice at 2:30 p.m. His receptionist later told the investigators that he had arrived that morning looking like a man who hadn't slept, had canceled all his appointments, and had spent an hour in his office before the agents came in. She said he hadn't seemed surprised. The Norcroft operatives who had been managing Helena's situation dispersed within hours of Pellerin's courtroom withdrawal. Professional contractors, no ideological investment in the outcome, paid for a service that was no longer being contracted. They left no forwarding information. The two who had been at the east wall of Blackthorn the night before were eventually identified and would become material witnesses in the federal case. Wren Daly, who had been Dorian's employee and had sold his knowledge to Norcroft, was located 4 days later in a city 300 miles away. He was not, in the end, prosecuted by any official authority. He was, however, strongly encouraged to make different professional choices going forward, in a conversation with Kessler that lasted 9 minutes and left Daly with a clear understanding of the full range of available consequences. It was not Dorian's cleanest resolution. It was the one that existed. The federal investigation moved faster than Helena had predicted. The financial forensics were extensive and damning. $29 million extracted over 11 years through a mechanism that Gale's testimony, once he began cooperating, confirmed had been designed with his explicit participation from the beginning. The salvage report on Nathaniel Vale's car was authenticated. The mechanic's death was reopened as a suspicious circumstances case. The investigation into whether Elliot Vale had ordered or arranged his brother's death would take considerably longer than the financial case. These things always did. But the evidentiary thread existed and was being followed by people whose professional investment was in following it to the end. Elliot Vale's arraignment on fraud, conspiracy, and elder abuse charges happened on a Thursday morning. He entered the courtroom in a suit that had been pressed in a holding facility and still managed to look expensive. His attorney was not Graham Pellerin. Pellerin had withdrawn from representation, citing a conflict of interest, and had not been replaced by anyone of equivalent caliber. Elliot stood straight, but the straightness had a quality of maintenance to it, the straightness of a man holding himself together by the deliberate rejection of the alternative. Rowan did not attend the arraignment. Dorian asked her once if she wanted to. She thought about it for a long moment. "No," she said. "I don't need to see that." He nodded. He understood. There is a particular type of person who needs to witness the fall of the thing that destroyed part of their life, who finds some essential completion in the image of the courthouse steps and the perp walk and the cameras. And there is another type of person who finds that completion elsewhere, in the quieter, more private confirmation that it happened, that it was real, that the machinery they were caught in has been dismantled. Rowan was the second type. She had always been the second type. She had been making do with private confirmations her entire life because the public ones had never been available to her. She read the federal filing documents instead. At the kitchen table at Blackthorn, 3 days after the hearing, with coffee going cold beside her and the legal pad open to a fresh page where she was making notes, not for litigation, but for herself. Recording it. Making it permanent in her own handwriting so that it existed somewhere outside the official record in a form she controlled. Dorian sat across from her at the kitchen table on one of those mornings. He had a file of his own open, legitimate business, the endless operational administration of a large and complicated enterprise, and they worked in parallel for the better part of an hour without speaking. It struck him, in the way that things strike you when you're not looking directly at them, that this was an unusual thing, that he had not sat at a kitchen table doing ordinary work in the presence of another person in a very long time, that the manor, which he had occupied as a fortress and a workspace and a statement of controlled power, had not felt like a place where ordinary things happened in years, possibly ever. He looked at Rowan. She was reading. She had a pencil behind her ear that she'd put there 20 minutes ago and forgotten. Her coffee was cold and she hadn't noticed. Her face, in the morning light, looked different than it had looked the night he'd found her behind the desk in the storm. Not unguarded. She was constitutionally incapable of being unguarded, probably permanently, which was a damage she would carry forward, and he had no illusions about that. But something had eased in it. Some perpetual calculation behind the eyes had quieted by a fraction. She looked up and caught him looking. He looked back down at his file without comment. She almost smiled. He could see it in his peripheral vision. Almost. 6 weeks after the hearing, the Independent Family Court Authority completed its review and issued its ruling. The guardianship was dissolved. All legal authority over Rowan Vale's person and estate was restored to Rowan Vale, effective immediately. The trust was placed under independent receivership pending the full recovery of assets, a process the court estimated would take between 8 and 14 months, given the complexity of the extraction mechanism. The trust, at its current depleted state, held approximately $9 million. The projected recovery from frozen domestic accounts was expected to bring it to somewhere between 19 and 22 million. The overseas accounts were being pursued through international channels that moved slower and would likely yield partial recovery over a longer timeline. She was not, in the end, left with $38 million. That money was gone in the way that stolen years are gone, irrecoverable in their original form, returnable only as compensation that doesn't quite fit the shape of what was taken. She was left with enough, and she was left with her name, her actual legal name attached to her actual legal identity, without the psychiatric addenda and the guardianship conditions and the documented history of instability that Elliot's machine had spent 3 years layering onto her record. The court's dissolution order included a formal expungement of the fraudulent psychiatric evaluations. Dr. Gale's medical license was suspended pending the outcome of the criminal case against him. The 3 other Gale victims, whose cases had been identified through Rowan's analysis, were referred to independent counsel. Patricia Osei called the day the dissolution order came through. She called to say that 2 of her own former clients, the ones who had been declared incompetent through Gale's earlier work, were being reviewed for potential reinstatement of their own legal standing. She said it carefully, in the measured language of an attorney who doesn't make promises about process outcomes. But she said it, and Rowan sat at the kitchen table and listened with her hand flat on the wood of the table and her eyes on the middle distance. And when she thanked Osei and hung up, she stayed very still for a long time. Dorian found her there an hour later. He sat down across from her. He didn't say anything. She looked at her hand on the table, at the fingers spread flat against the grain. 2 people, she said. 2 people who went through what I went through. Before me. Maybe there were others. Probably there were others. She paused. If I'd been found a year later, there would have been more. Yes, he said, because it was true and she didn't need him to soften it. I can't fix that, she said. No. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dry. She had cried exactly once in the past 6 weeks, the night after the hearing, alone in her room, and he'd heard it through the wall and said nothing because it hadn't been the kind of crying that asked for anything. It had been the kind that just needed to happen. You could have sent me away, she said. The school, the easy thing. I'm not known for the easy thing, he said. No. She looked at him steadily. What happens now? With me? He had thought about this. He had thought about it with the same operational clarity he brought to everything, and he had arrived at the same answer from 4 different directions, which was usually a sign that the answer was correct. You're 18 in 7 months, he said. When you're 18, you have full legal control of whatever the receivership has recovered. You have enough to build something real. He paused. What you do between now and then and after is yours to decide. You can stay here until you know what you want. You can leave whenever you want. You're not here because you have to be. She was quiet for a moment. I know, she said. I've known that for a while. The difference between staying because you have to and staying because you choose to is the whole distance between a cage and a home, and she had crossed that distance sometime in the past months without announcing it. He'd noticed. He hadn't said anything because she didn't need him to name it for her. My father, she said then, quietly, coming back to it the way you come back to things that have no resolution yet but need to be held in the light regularly. The investigation. It's ongoing, he said. It'll take time, maybe a long time. Will they find enough? He thought about the suppressed salvage report, the mechanic's convenient death. Elliot Vale, who had apparently spent 2 decades on a careful, patient program of removing obstacles that stood between himself and $38 million, and who had begun that program by removing his own brother. Yes, Dorian said. I think they will. She nodded. Her jaw worked for a moment. She pressed her hand flat against the table again, feeling the grain. He held my hands when he told me, she said. At the school, in the headmaster's office. She looked at her own hands. I thought he was crying because he was sad. I was 11, she paused. I've been thinking about that for 6 years, thinking I must have missed something, some sign. She looked up. I didn't miss anything. He's just very good at it. Yes, Dorian said. He is. That's... She stopped, started again. That's the part I have to figure out what to do with. The fact that there wasn't a sign. That I trusted him at 11, and the reason I trusted him was that he was trustworthy seeming, not because I was wrong or naive or... She stopped again. You were 11, Dorian said, and he had been practicing his whole life. She held his gaze. Is that supposed to make me feel better? She said. Not bitterly, genuinely asking. No, he said. It's just true. She looked at him for a long moment, and then she did something he hadn't expected. She laughed. Short, quiet, a little ragged at the edges, but real. The laugh of someone who has been handed an honest answer when they braced for comfort. Okay, she said. She pushed her chair back and stood. She picked up her cold coffee and took it to the sink and poured it out. She rinsed the cup. Small domestic actions, ordinary, the kind of things that happen in kitchens where people are simply living. She set the cup in the drying rack and stood at the sink for a moment, looking out the kitchen window at the grounds. The morning was gray but clear. The trees along the north wall had begun to turn at the edges, first hint of autumn coming in. The cameras on the perimeter posts were running their rotation. The grounds were quiet. The nightmares, she said, still looking out the window. They're less. He didn't respond immediately. He let the statement exist. Not gone, she said, but less. That's how it usually works, he said. She turned from the window. She leaned against the counter with her arms crossed, not the old defensive crossing, the armor-up posture, but the relaxed crossing of someone simply occupying a room. What were you like, she said, before all of this? Before the... She gestured vaguely, meaning the empire, the fortress, the armed men, and the bulletproof glass and the decades of operational ruthlessness. He looked at her. Younger, he said. She waited. Angrier, he said. I had things I needed to prove to people who weren't worth proving things to, and I built all of this partly to prove them. The people are dead now. He paused. The thing is still here. She absorbed this. Do you regret it? She said. He thought about it honestly. No, he said, but I'd have done parts of it differently. He looked at the table, at the files still open there. Less of certain things, more of others. She didn't push for specifics. She understood that the sentence was complete. I'm going to the library, she said. Okay. She started toward the door, stopped. Dorian. She said his name the way she'd started saying it in the past few weeks, without the slight hesitation that used to precede it, the half-second pause of someone checking whether using the name is allowed. Thank you. He looked at her. For not sending me away, she said. When it would have been easier. He held her gaze. He thought about the school brochure on his desk, the glossy photographs of hills and lakes, the option that had seemed like kindness before he understood what kindness actually required. "Don't thank me for that," he said. "Why not?" "Because I was going to," he said. "I'd made the arrangements. Marin was right that it was the better option. I just stopped making that particular decision before I'd finished making it." She looked at him for a long moment. "But you did stop," she said. He had nothing to add to that. She was right, and the rightness of it didn't require elaboration. She left for the library. He sat at the kitchen table for a while longer. Outside, the grounds caught some pale morning sun, and the dew on the grass went briefly bright before the gray came back. He could hear, faintly, the footsteps of the perimeter patrol. He could hear, from somewhere deeper in the house, the sound of the library door opening and then closing. He looked at the file on the table, at the ordinary work of an ordinary morning. He thought about Nathaniel Vale's car going into a lake in the dark. He thought about a mechanic who wrote an honest report and died at 39. He thought about a man who had been capable of all of that, who had sat in a headmaster's office and held a grieving 11-year-old's hands with performance tears on his face, who had looked at a child with money and seen only the money. He thought about what it meant to be the kind of man who did those things, and he thought, with the specific honesty that came from living inside his own particular history, about the distance between Elliot Vale and himself. It was not a comfortable distance. It was not a simple distance. It was the distance between a man who destroyed people for money and a man who had done other things for other reasons. And the geography of that distance was complicated terrain that Dorian had stopped pretending was simpler than it was. But he was here, in this kitchen. And Rowan was in the library. And Helena Marsh had gone home to her own house in her own bed on the night they'd brought her out of that hotel. And Patricia Osei's clients were having their cases reviewed, and a mechanic named no one would tell him was being given, posthumously, the honesty that his honest report deserved. The outcomes were imperfect. They always were. They were real. He closed the file. He stood up and took his own cup to the sink and rinsed it and set it in the drying rack beside hers. 2 cups. A small thing. The kind of small thing you don't notice until you notice it. He stood at the window where she'd stood and looked out at the grounds. The pale sun had found a gap in the clouds and was doing something brief and specific to the grass along the east wall, lighting a strip of it up bright green against the gray of everything else. He watched it for a while. Then he went back to work. Weeks later, not many, but enough, Rowan stood on the manor balcony in the early evening. The city lights were coming up below the estate walls the way they did every night, orange and white and the occasional hard blue of something commercial. The air was cooling toward actual autumn now, and she had a sweater on, her arms loose at her sides, her face turned toward the lights. She heard Dorian's step behind her. She didn't turn. He stood beside her. They looked at the city together. "They froze the overseas accounts today," she said. 3 of them. "Thorne sent me the documentation." "I know, he sent it to me too." She nodded. A car moved in the street below the wall, its headlights sweeping briefly across the stone before disappearing around a corner. "I've been thinking about school," she said. "Not the one Marin found, something else. There's a program in the city, Law and Public Policy, evening curriculum for non-traditional students. You can start at 17 with documented completion of certain prerequisites." She paused. "I have the prerequisites." He looked at the side of her face. "When does it start?" he said. "January." "That's 4 months." "Yes." He looked back at the city. "I'll have someone drive you," he said. "I can take the train." "You can take the train when the Norcroft situation has been fully resolved and the last of Elliot's people have been accounted for." He said it without emphasis, a statement of operational fact. "Until then, someone drives you." She was quiet for a moment. "Okay," she said. Not submission, agreement. The specific difference between those 2 things was something she had spent years learning to feel, and she felt it now, and the feeling was clean. The city hummed below them. Traffic, wind, the distant sound of something that might have been music from a bar somewhere on the avenue. The ordinary noise of a city moving through its evening without particular knowledge of what had happened inside these walls over the past months, which was as it should be. The world didn't need to know. The record existed. The people involved knew what was true. That was enough. Rowan put her hands on the balcony railing. She looked at them there. Her hands, her actual hands, not clutching anything, not braced for impact, not folded into her sleeves to hide the marks she didn't make on herself anymore. Just her hands on a railing in the evening air. "Nowhere," she said quietly. Dorian looked at her. "When you asked where I wanted to go," she said, "I know that was months ago, but the answer is the same." She looked at the city. "Not because I'm afraid of it. I'm going to go out into it, study in it, do something in it eventually." She paused. "I just mean that when you ask me where I want to be, the answer is here. That's not the same thing it was when I first got here." "I know," he said. "I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go." "I know that too." She looked at him then, fully turned and looked at him the way she'd started doing in the past weeks, directly, without the split-second assessment of threat that used to precede any sustained eye contact. He looked back. "You're still the most frightening person I've ever met," she said. "That's a low bar given your family." She laughed again, the same laugh as the kitchen. Real, a little ragged, entirely hers. He looked back at the city. "Go inside," he said. "It's cold." In a minute, she turned back to the lights. She stayed for another few minutes, watching the city do what cities do in the evening. Pulse and breathe and continue, indifferent and magnificent and full of people who were in the middle of their own stories, most of which would never intersect with hers, all of which were being lived with the same ordinary courage and ordinary failure that characterized being a person in a world that didn't arrange itself around your needs. She had learned that early, earlier than she should have. She was learning, slowly, that knowing it early didn't mean it had to define the rest. She pushed off the railing. She went inside. The balcony doors closed behind her, and the city lights stayed on, and the evening continued, and in the library of Blackthorn Manor, a lamp was burning in the window that faced east, the way it had started burning every night for the past several months, visible from the service road and the perimeter wall in the street below. A small, steady light in a building full of complicated history, doing what lights do. Holding the dark at a distance. Not defeating it, just holding it. Which, in the end, was all anyone could do. And it was enough. It had always been enough. It just took some people longer than others to find something worth holding it for.